Returning to Paul Johnson's A History of the Jews. In collecting and codifying Israeli law, therefore, Moses had ample precedent. He had been brought up at court. He was literate. To set down the law in writing, to have it carved in stone, was part of the liberating act of fleeing from Egypt, where there was no statutory law, to Asia, where it was by now the custom. Nonetheless, though the Mosaic Code was in this sense part of the Near Eastern tradition, its divergencies from all other ancient codes are so many and so fundamental as to make it something entirely new. Firstly, the other law codes, though said to be inspired by God, are given and worded by individual kings, such as Hammurabi or Ishtar. They are thus revocable, changeable, and essentially secular. By contrast, in the Bible, God alone writes the law. Legislation throughout the Pentateuch is all his, and no Israelite king was ever permitted or even attempted to formulate a law code. Moses, and much later Ezekiel, transmitter of the law reforms, was a prophet, not a king, and a divine medium and not a sovereign legislator. Hence, in his code, there is no distinction between the religious and the secular. All are one, or between civil, criminal, and moral law. This indivisibility had important practical consequences. In Mosaic legal theory, all breaches of the law offend God. All crimes are sins, just as all sins are crimes. Offenses are absolute wrongs, beyond the power of man unaided to pardon or expunge. Making restitution to the offended mortal is not enough. God requires expiation too, and this may involve drastic punishment. Most law codes of the ancient Near East are property-oriented, people themselves being forms of property whose value can be assessed. The Mosaic Code is God-oriented. For instance, in other codes, a husband may pardon an adulterous wife and her lover. The Mosaic Code, by contrast, insists both must be put to death. Again, whereas the other codes include the royal right to pardon even in capital cases, the Bible provides no such remedy. Indeed, in capital cases, it repudiates the notion of rich man's law. A murderer, however rich, cannot escape execution by paying money, even if his victim is a mere servant or slave. And there are many other crimes where God's anger is so great that financial compensation is not enough to appease the divine wrath. Where, however, the intention is not to wound or kill or sin grievously, the injury is the unintended consequence of mischievous behavior. God is less offended, and the laws of compensation apply. The offender then shall pay as the judges determine. This applied, the Mosaic Code laid down, in the case where a man strikes a woman and she has a miscarriage, or when death follows a culpable accident, and in all lesser cases, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, hand for a hand, foot for a foot. A much misunderstood passage, which simply means that strict compensation for the injury is due. On the other hand, where the decree of culpability for an injury, though accidental, is criminal, the capital law must take its course. Thus an ox which gores a man to death is simply forfeit, and the owner unpunished. But if he knows his beast is dangerous, and he has failed to take proper measures, and a man is killed in consequence, the owner must suffer capitally. This last provision, known as the law of the goring ox, testifies to the huge importance the Mosaic Code attaches to human life. There is a paradox here, as there is in all ethical use of capital punishment. In Mosaic theology, man is made in God's image, and so his life is not just valuable, it is sacred. To kill a man is an offense against God so grievous that the ultimate punishment, the forfeiture of life, must follow. Money is not enough. The horrific act of execution thus underscores the sanctity of human life. Under Mosaic law, then, many men and women met their deaths whom the secular codes of surrounding societies would have simply permitted to compensate their victims or their victims' families. But the converse is also true. As a result of the same axiom, whereas other codes provided the death penalty for offenses against property, such as looting during a fire, breaking into a house, a serious trespass by night, or theft of a wife, in the Mosaic law no property offense is capital. Human life is too sacred where the rights of property alone are violated. It also repudiates vicarious punishment. The offenses of parents must not be punished by the execution of sons or daughters, or the husband's crime by the surrender of the wife to prostitution. Moreover, not only is human life sacred, the human person, being in God's image, is precious. Whereas, for instance, the Mid-Assyrian Code lists a fierce series of physical punishments, including facial mutilation, castration, impalement, and flogging to death. The Mosaic Code treats the body with respect. Physical cruelty is reduced to the minimum. Even flogging was limited to 40 strokes, and must be carried out before the face of the judge, lest if he should exceed and beat him above these with many stripes, then thy brother should seem vile unto thee. The fact is, the Mosaic Code was far more humane than any other, because being God-centered, it was automatically man-centered also. The core of the Mosaic Code was the Decalogue, the statements of God related by Moses, Deuteronomy 5, verses 6 to 18, and entitled the 10 Words or Utterances, Deuteronomy 4, verse 13. The supposed original versions of these commands is given in Exodus 20, verses 2 to 14. There are many unresolved problems and obscurities in the texts. It seems likely that in their original form, the commands were simple, even terse, and only later elaborated. The earliest form, as given directly by Moses, has been reconstructed as follows, following naturally into 3 groups, 1 to 4, covering the relations between God and man, 6 to 10 dealing with relations between men, and the 5th acting as a bridge between the two, dealing with parents and children. Thus we get I am WHWH. This is a representation, of course, for an abbreviation. Your God. You shall have no other gods besides me. You shall not make yourselves a graven image. You shall not make the name of WHW. Sorry, it's I'm sorry. It's YHWH. YHWH. Picking up from there, thus we get I am YHWH, your God. You shall have no other gods besides me. You shall not make yourselves a graven image. You shall not take the name of YHWH in vain. Remember the Sabbath day. Honor your father and your mother. You shall not kill. Yeah, and just a personal footnote, I know there are plenty of people who wish to express this name, and plenty of people out there who wish to pronounce this name. I'm not going to do that. It's not important to this particular aspect of historical account. And every time I see that, I will simply pronounce the letters themselves. Okay? Picking up. Remember the Sabbath day. Honor your father and your mother. You shall not kill. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness. You shall not covet. Some of these ethical rules are common to other ancient Near Eastern civilizations. There is, for instance, an Egyptian document known as the Protestations of Guiltlessness, in which a dead soul at the final judgment recites a list of offenses not committed. But for a comprehensive summary of right conduct to God and man, offered to, accepted by, and graven upon the hearts of an entire people, there is nothing in antiquity remotely comparable to the Ten Commandments. The Decalogue was the basis of the covenant with God, first made by Abraham, renewed by Jacob, and now renewed again in the solemn and public manner by Moses and the entire people. Is that so? Interesting. What people might find more interesting about this statement is Mr. Johnson's references or sources for such a statement. It might surprise people where that comes from. And it might also surprise people if they found out whether or not Mr. Johnson believes that. Anyway, modern research shows that the Mosaic Covenant, set out briefly in Exodus 19-24, and again more elaborately in the book of Deuteronomy, follows the form of the ancient Near Eastern treaty, such as those drawn up by the Hittites. It has a historical prolegomena setting out the purpose followed by the nature of the undertaking, the divine witnesses, benefits, and cures, the text and the deposit of the tablets on which it is written. But the Mosaic Covenant is unique in being not a treaty between states, but a God-people alliance. In it, in effect, the ancient Israelite society merged its interest with God's and accepted him in return for protection and prosperity as a totalitarian ruler whose wishes governed every aspect of their lives. Watch it, Johnson. Thus the Decalogue is merely the heart of an elaborate system of divine laws set out in the books of Exodus, Deuteronomy, and Numbers. In late antiquity, Judaic scholars organized the laws into 613 commandments, consisting of 248 mandatory commandments and 365 prohibitions. This Mosaic legal material covers an immense variety of subjects. By no means all of it dates from Moses' time, let alone in the form it has come down to us. Some of it deals with settled agriculture, for instance, and must date from the period after the conquest of Canaan, It is conjectured that this was simply taking over from Canaanite law, ultimately of Sumerian, Babylonian, Assyrian, and Hittite origin. But the Israelites were already becoming a very legal-minded people, quite capable of innovation, or of transforming the notions they found around them so thoroughly as to constitute novelty. The old theory that the mass of the Mosaic material derives from post-exilic times can now be dismissed. The technical book of Leviticus, highly ritualistic and providing the legal basis for organized religions and civic life among the Israelites, fits in very well with what we know of the political history of the Israelites in the 13th and 12th centuries BC. The same can be said for Deuteronomy, which is a popular presentation for a general audience of the priestly writings in Leviticus. The material concerns such matters as diet, medicine, rudimentary science, and professional practice, as well as law. Much of it is highly original, but all of it is consistent with non-biblical material, covering similar topics, which was composed in the Near East in the Late Bronze Age, or had already been circulating for centuries. But though in some ways the Israelites of Moses' time were typical of their age, certain marked characteristics were emerging. The Mosaic laws were very strict in sexual matters. For instance, the Ugaritic laws revealed in the Ras Shamra tablets permitted fornication, adultery, bestiality, and incest in certain circumstances. The Hittites would allow some forms of bestiality, though not incest. The Egyptians regarded consanguinity as relatively unimportant. The Israelites, by contrast, banned all irregular forms of sex, and they had a list of forbidden degrees of marriage, including affinity as well as consanguinity. The Israelites seem to have derived some of their dietary laws from the Egyptians, but there were many differences. Israelites, like Egyptians, were forbidden creatures from the sea, which had no fins or scales. Pious Egyptians, however, were not supposed to eat fish at all. Okay, hold on, back up there. Okay, right, moving on. Excuse me. On the other hand, they could and did eat many kinds of waterfowl, which the Israelites were forbidden. But they, like the Egyptians, could eat doves, pigeons, geese, and other domestic fowl, partridges, and quail. There seems to have been some kind of crude scientific basis rather than pure superstition for most of the Mosaic rules. Predatory and carnivorous animals were regarded as risky and forbidden. Clean animals were, on the whole, exclusively vegetarian, cloven-footed, and ruminant. Mouflon, antelope, roebuck, ibex, fallow, deer, and gazelle. Swine were forbidden because they were dangerous when eaten undercooked, harboring parasitic organisms. The Israelites would not touch raptors or vultures either. They classified the camel as unclean because it was valuable. What is more difficult to understand is why they banned hares and conies. Okay, just personal footnote. I'm not going to take a stand on this, but of course it would be difficult to understand is why they banned hares and conies. Because, first of all, he implants a secular view as to why swine were forbidden because of their harboring parasites, or when undercooked it could get you sick, and these things. These things, which are in fact true, but there is no reference or source material in the Bible or in the Jewish faith or in their explanations that would support that idea. And it's one thing to offer something like that as a suggestion, but to impose it as historical with any historical validity, as if, oh, this is why. It's just kind of wrong. You know what I mean? It's kind of wrong. Like, there are more serious, I wouldn't call them offenses, but I'd call them more as impositions or yeah, yeah, imposition would be a good one, where you impose your first century theology, like using the figures of John and Jesus and the Apostle Paul in descriptions of what was taking place during the times of Abraham. It's an it's a very played out Christian technique of um, reconciling the two faith structures together, knitting them together early on before you're like, if you're going to be a historian, be a historian, and remember that those things are based on source material. It's just like, I find Johnson a good read. Like, I find that his style of writing is very easy to follow, and it's smooth, and I really enjoy it. But things like that really tick me off, and I think I'm gonna have to bite my tongue as we're making our way through this, because there's a lot of things that are gonna come up here that I'm just gonna be like, what? This particular book is from 1970, I believe, or is it? Hold on now, is it 70, 71? No, this is okay. This says 87. First published Great Britain. Oh, I see. First paperback edition published 1988. If anyone out there has the background on this release, when this was actually published, let me know. But I mean, some of the ideas. Anyway, I'm not really here to debate Johnson. I'm here, like many of you are here, to dig up a good history, right? But anyway, yeah, I'm going to try to avoid those things, and I'm going to get back to this because I'm sure you'd much rather hear the reading of this and not my rants. But anyway, every once in a while that's going to happen. I can't guarantee to button my lip every time. All right? So, where were we here? Right. Israelite laws on hygiene usually followed Egyptian practice. There is a great deal of medical lore in the Mosaic material, and much of this also comes from Egypt, which had a medical tradition going back at least to Imhotep, around 2650 BC. For the most important Egyptian medical papyri, even in the copies we possess, were earlier than or contemporary with the Mosaic era. Medical empiricism was often enacted in ancient legal codes of the second millennium BC. In the Law of Hammurabi, for instance, written about 500 years before Moses' day. Yeah. But the famous section in the Bible dealing with leprosy, which sets down the diagnostic and therapeutic duties of a special category of priest, is unique. What is also unique is, and already in Mosaic times possessing a long history, is the Israelite stress on circumcision. This practice was not used among the Canaanites or Philistines or the Assyrians and Babylonians. The Edomites, Moabites, and Ammonites used it, and so did the Egyptians. But none of these societies attached transcendent importance to the custom, and one has the impression it was generally dying out in the second millennium BC. This in itself attests the antiquity of the Israelite custom, which is first mentioned as being performed by Abraham as part of his original covenant. The great French scholar Père de Vaux believed that the Israelites first used it as an initiation rite before marriage. For those ancient societies which practiced it, it was its function, and it was performed around the age of 13. But Moses' son was circumcised at birth by his mother Zipporah. Exodus 4, verses 24 to 6. 24 to 26. And the ceremonial removal of the foreskin on the 8th day after birth was then enshrined in the Mosaic legislation. Leviticus 12, verse 3. Thus the Israelites divorced the rite from its link to male puberty, and in accordance with their already marked tendency to historicize custom, made it an indelible symbol of an historic covenant and membership of a chosen people. They kept up the tradition going back to Abraham that ancient flint knives must be used. The law of circumcision was retained long after all other early societies had abandoned it, as an indelible sign of the unity between the people and their beliefs. It was not just, as Tacitus was to sneer, to make Jews different, but of course it did this too, and was another element added to the growing pattern of anti-Semitism. The Sabbath was the other great and ancient institution which differentiated the Israelites from other peoples, and was also the seed of future unpopularity. The idea seems to have been derived from Babylonian astronomy, but its rationale in the books of Exodus and Deuteronomy is variously stated as commemorating God's rest after creation, the liberation of Israel from Egyptian slavery, and the humanitarian need to give laborers, especially slaves and beasts of burden, some respite. The day of rest is one of the great Jewish contributions to the comfort and joy of mankind, but it was a holy day as well as a rest day, being increasingly associated in the minds of the people with the belief in the elect nation of God, so that eventually Ezekiel has God present it as designed to differentiate Jews from others. Moreover, also I gave them my Sabbaths, to be a sign between me and them, that they might know that I am the Lord, that sanctify them. So this too became an element in the belief of other peoples, that the Jews held aloof from the rest of humanity. The Israelites were already in the process of becoming very distinctive, and in certain critical respects they were spiritually in advance of their age. But they were a primitive people by the standards of advanced societies in 1250 BC. Even in their spirituality, they retained many backward elements, and continued to do so for centuries. Indeed, being both historically minded and legalistic, they were inclined to formalize and cling to old superstitions. There were many taboos, for instance, concerning sex, blood, and battle. Belief in magic was ubiquitous and institutionalized. Moses not only talked to God face to face and presided over stupendous miracles, he also performed magic tricks, staffs and rods, which turned into snakes. The vulgar commonplace of ancient Near Eastern magic were part of Israelite religion too, and sanctified from the age of Moses and Aaron onward. The earlier prophets, at least, were expected to perform and often wore the magician's apparatus. We read of charismatic cloaks, of mantles as worn by Elijah and inherited by Elisha. Zedekiah made himself a pair of magic iron horns. Samson illustrated the belief that hair was a locus of power, and this was reflected in ritual tonsure. Prophets practiced ecstasy states and may have used incense and narcotics to produce impressive effects. You see what I mean? Like, stop it. Oh, yeah, sure, possible, but stow it, you know? Sorry. In one book of the Bible alone, the performances recorded include a magnet trick, a water trick, imposing disease, curing it, an antidote to poison, a bringing back to life, causing lightning to strike, expanding an oil jar, and feeding a multitude. All the same, the Israelites were the first people to bring their reasons systematically to bear on religious questions. From Moses' day onwards, and throughout their history, rationalism was a central element in Jewish belief. In a sense, it is the central element, for monotheism is itself a rationalization. If supernatural, unearthly power exists, how can it be, as it were, radiated from woods and springs, rivers and rocks? If the motions of the sun and the moon and stars can be predicted and measured, and thus obey regular laws, how can they be the source of unnatural authority, since they too are plainly part of nature? Who's to say that nature isn't in itself supernatural? Sorry, that was my personal question. Like, this guy. Anyway, okay. Only into like page 38, I'm starting to get an idea of what kind of individual we're dealing with here. And not to judge him, but I'm, getting a feel for his, I don't know, his aloofness to religious sensibilities, I guess. He's trying to come up with all these different scientific explanations for why this might have been and what. Like, dude, you're a historian. Stick to source material. Stop messing around, all right? Just my opinion. Anyway. Whence then comes the power? Just as man learns to lord over nature, animal and inanimate, must not divine power, a fortiori, be living and personal? And if God lives, how can his power be arbitrarily and unequally divided into a pantheon of deities? The idea of a limited God is a contradiction. Once the process of reason is applied to divinity, the idea of a sole, omnipotent, and personal God, who, being infinitely superior to man in power and therefore virtue, is consistently guided in his actions by systematic ethical principles, follows as a matter of course. Looking back from the perspective of the 20th century, we see Judaism as the most conservative of religions, but in its origins it was the most revolutionary. Ethical monotheism began the process whereby the world picture of antiquity was destroyed. Granted the concept of sole, omnipotent God, the Israelites rightly deduced that he could not be, as the pagan gods were, part of the world or even the whole. He was not one of the forces which sustained the universe, or even all of them. His dimensions were infinitely greater. The entire universe was his mere creation. The Israelites thus attributed a far greater power and distance to God than any other religion of antiquity. God is the cause of all things, from earthquakes to political and military disasters. There is no other source of power. Demons being God activated. Divinity is indivisible, unique, single. And since God is not merely bigger than the world, but infinitely bigger, the idea of representing him is absurd. Okay, thank you for getting to the point. That is the point. Don't place definitions. It stands to reason, then, that to try to make an image of him is insulting. The Israelite ban on images, though not the oldest part of their religion, is very ancient and emerged soon after the cult of monotheism became established. It became the fiery symbol of the religion's Puritan fundamentalist, the aspect they found most difficult to impose on the nation as a whole. The most obvious, visible difference between the Israelite religion and all others, and the dogma the rest of the world most resented, since it meant that strict Israelites and later Jews could not honor their gods. It was closely linked not just to Israelite exclusiveness, but to aggression, since they were told not merely to forswear images, but destroy them. You shall tear down their altars and break their pillars and cut down their Asherim, for you shall worship no other God, for the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God, lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, and when you play the harlot after their gods and sacrifice to their gods, the one invites you, you eat of his sacrifice, and you take of their daughters for your sons, and their daughters play the harlot after their gods, and make your sons play the harlot after their gods. This passage from Exodus reflects a terrible fear and fanaticism. Moreover, the Israelites were wrong to suppose, if they did suppose, that the use of images was a form of religious infantilism. Most Near Eastern religions of antiquity did not regard idols of wood or stone or bronze as gods in themselves. They saw the images as a practical means whereby the ordinary simple worshipper, why is that distinction made? Anyway, they saw the image as a practical means whereby the ordinary simple worshipper can visualize the divinity and achieve spiritual communion with him. This has always been the Roman Catholic justification for the use of images, not just of God, but of saints. In moving from paganism, the Israelites were clearly right to insist on a greater intellectualization of the deity, a move towards the abstract. It was part of their religious revolution. But intellectualization is difficult, and the Israelites themselves did not despise visual aids, albeit verbal images. The Bible abounds with anthropomorphism of the deity. There is a further contradiction. How can man be made in God's image if the image of God is unimaginable, and therefore forbidden? Yet the idea of man, as conceived in the divine image, is as central to the religion as the ban on idols. In a way, it is the foundation of its morality, being an enormously comprehensive principle. As man is in God's image, he belongs to God. The concept helps man to grasp that he does not possess real and permanent ownership, even over himself, let alone over anything else he receives from God's bounty. His body is a leasehold. He is unanswerable to God and what he does to and with it. But the principle also means that the body, man, must be treated with respect and even dignity. Man has inalienable rights. Indeed, the Mosaic Code is the code not only of obligations and prohibitions, but also in embryonic form of rights. It is more. It is a primitive declaration of equality. Not only is man as a category created in God's image, all individual men are also created in God's image. In this sense, they are all equal. Nor is this equality notional. It is real in one all-important sense. All Israelites are equal before God, and therefore equal before his law. Justice is for all, irrespective of other inequalities which may exist. All kinds of privileges are implicit and explicit in the Mosaic Code, but on essentials it does not distinguish between varieties of the faithful. All, moreover, shared in accepting the covenant. It was a popular, even a democratic decision. Thus, the Israelites were creating a new kind of society. Josephus later used the term theocracy. This he defined as placing all sovereignty in the hands of God. The sages were to call it taking on the yoke. The sages were to call it taking on the yoke of the kingdom of heaven. The Israelites might have magistrates of one kind or another, but their rule was vicarious, since God made the law and constantly intervened to ensure it was obeyed. The fact that God ruled meant that, in practice, his law ruled. And since all were equally subject to the law, the system was the first to embody the double merits of the rule of law and equality before the law. Philo called it democracy, which he described as the most law-abiding and best of constitutions. But the democracy he did not mean rule by all the people. He defined it as a form of government which honors equality and has law and justice for its rulers. He might have called the Jewish system more accurately a democratic theocracy, because in essence, that is what it was. In the age of Moses, then, the Israelites were strengthening and confirming a tendency we have already noted to be subversive of the existing order. They were a servile people who rose up against their Egyptian master, and most ancient and autocratic monarchy in the world, that being the Egyptians. Again, the most ancient and autocratic monarchy in the world. They fled into the desert and received their laws in mass popular assembly, not in some long-established city, but on the bare mountainside from a wild leader who did not even call himself a king. We do not know where Moses' Mount Sinai was. It may have been a still active volcano. The present monastery of Sinai has always been a Christian site. It goes back certainly to the 4th century AD, and perhaps to about 200 years before. But even that was 1,450 years after Moses came down from the mountain. It is likely that after the Israelites settled in Canaan, the Mosaic Sinai remained a pilgrimage site for generations, but the tradition eventually lapsed and the site fell out of memory, and it is most improbable that the early Christians went to the right place. Okay, I mean, come on! First of all, it was most improbable that the early Christians went to the right place. Oh yeah, a little bit improbable. But speaking of improbability, I mean, okay, right now in this section, he's defining Mosaic Code. And what we know that means today is that Orthodox Jews follow a strict code of law. It's all about the law. That's what Talmud's about. That's what their life is about. It's all about law, 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 law. And I get that. And so if you're defining that, how can you turn around and say that, oh, it was probably a tradition for them to travel to Mount Sinai on a pilgrimage? You know, I hear what he's saying, sort of like Mecca today for Muslims who make the pilgrimage to Mecca at least once in their lifetime. I get that. But eventually the tradition kind of fell away and they forgot where the fucking mountain was. Excuse my language. Kind of doubt it. Like, what? What an imbecile. I'm sorry, but some of this stuff, you know, they think they're so sophisticated, but when you actually read back what they're actually saying, they come across as simpletons. It's just ridiculous. Anyway, moving on. All the same, This dramatic place, with its fierce and terrible beauty, has poetic aptness. It is the right setting for the formative act of a revolutionary people who did not recognize the cities, power, and wealth of the day, and who were able to perceive that there is a moral order superior to the order of the world. Later, in a dramatic passage, Deutero-Isaiah was to see. Okay, now we're getting all right. Deutero-Isaiah. Now we're getting the rabbis, if they've happened to take a peek at his work here, their yarmulkes just flipped, right? They hate that. Here we go. Deutero-Isaiah was to express the Jewish exaltation of powerlessness in the person of the suffering servant of the Lord, who in the end is victorious, and later still a Jewish sectarian. St. Paul was to ask, okay, all right, anyway, gonna just read it. Take a deep breath. Hath not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? And to quote the scriptures, for it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and will bring to nothing the understanding of the prudent. But the spring of this tradition opened at Sinai. Okay. And for those of you who may not know, the concept of Deutero-Isaiah suggests, and this is more of an academic acceptance, I would say, that the book of Isaiah, its later portions, in the high 40s and 50s, sorry, let's just say the latter, the tip of Isaiah, the latter portion of Isaiah was written much later than when the prophet lived, that which generally accepted the earlier books. So, the religious authorities and the academics argue this point. I won't. I don't want to get into it. I don't know enough about it, but that's what that means usually when they're saying Deutero-Isaiah, right? Because they also suggest that Deuteronomy was also not written until much later. Either just before the return out of Babylon, when they got into the temple, and it's surprising, we found this book of Moses. They're suggesting that the other books of Moses were written at an earlier stage, and Deuteronomy was plopped in amongst the rest of them. Personally, if I was to be heretical or go against the grain as far as the faith would go for Christians and Jews alike, I would say that if you're going to go that far, you might as well go as far as to say that the book of Genesis wasn't something that was being carried around until the Babylonian exile, based on, don't get excited, but I'm not suggesting this happened, but it's certainly, there's a clear path for raising the question that Book of Genesis was written during the time of exile in Babylon, when the Yehudis found themselves immersed in the actual writings of the Babylonians, which, we need not get into that, but when you start looking into those things, you find that a lot of the creation story stuff is there, and long before, but anyway, we won't be going there today. Boy, I'm in a mood today. Anyway, let's just continue with the read. I'm so sorry. I have to apologize for these rants. With their long experience of being strangers and sojourners, for the Israelites, their exodus from Egypt and their wanderings in the desert and mountain country of Sinai were nothing new. But this episode of perhaps half a century tended to confirm their singularity, their antinomianism, their apartness. Antinomianism, singularity, apartness. It is curious, as the Jewish historian Salo Baron has pointed out, that the God they worship, despite his epiphany on Mount Sinai, remained portable, as in Abraham's days. He dwelt in the ark, a kind of large, elaborate dog kennel, or was present in the tabernacle, in the tent, or operated through the casting lots, Urim and Thummim. This movable core was present even during the period of the temple, and the idea that God has no fixed abode was easily resumed after the temple fell, and has been paramount ever since in Judaism. It fits more naturally into the Jewish notion of the universal and ubiquitous but invisible God. It reflects to an extraordinary adaptability in the people, a great skill in putting down roots quickly, pulling them up, and re-establishing them elsewhere, an admirable tenacity of purpose, irrespective of the setting, as Baron has put it, the religious and ethic power of perseverance, rather than the political power of expansion and conquest, became the cornerstone of Jewish belief and practice. Nevertheless, it must be stressed again that the Israelites, though inclined to restlessness, were not desert nomads by origin or inclination. Even their Sinai wanderings were not truly nomadic. The bulk of the Exodus narratives, covering some 37 years, center on the conquest of Kadesh, or Kadesh, which was rich and well-watered, and was taken from the settled Amalekites. Some other sites mentioned in Exodus have been tentatively identified, but plotting the wanderings on the map, though often attempted and undoubtedly entertaining, can produce nothing more than conjecture. One interesting theory is that the Levite tribe, to which Moses himself belonged, and which soon claimed the exclusive right to the priesthood, was the first to settle in Kadesh, and there elaborated the new religion. The other tribes were already in Canaan. The last to force its way into the promised land were the tribe of Joseph from Egypt and the Levites of Kadesh, who had been reformed by Moses as an instrument for the fervent worship of Yahweh. Under its dynamic impulse, the new Israelite society came into being, religion being the catalyst. It is plausible, but undemonstrable. With the entry into the conquest of Canaan, however, the pattern of historical events begins to clarify as more and more archaeological evidence confirms or illuminates the biblical record. The book of Joshua, called after the Israelites' first great military commander, can now be regarded as essentially an historical account, though with important qualifications. Joshua, son of Nun, of the tribe of Ephraim, was Moses' security chief, acting as his bodyguard at Sinai and commanding the guard of the tent. He established his military reputation during the wanderings in a desperate encounter at Rephidim with a band commanded by the Sheikh Amalek. Moses commanded Joshua to go out, fight with Amalek, while he himself stood on top of the hill with the rod of God in mine hand. Aaron and Hur held up the old prophet's hands to encourage the warriors, and his hands were steady until the going down of the sun, and Joshua discomfited Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. Just before his death, Moses transferred the leadership to Joshua and set him over the congregation at a solemn public ceremony. This made him a prophet as well as a general, and Joshua, the son of Nun, was full of the spirit of wisdom, for Moses had laid his hands upon him. Thus Joshua began, and to a great extent completed, the conquest of Canaan. He may not have commanded all the Israelites, at any rate at the beginning, nor did he conduct a full-scale invasion. Much of the settlement was a process of infiltration and reinforcement of affiliated tribes who, as we have seen, already held such towns as Shechem. But there were numerous skirmishes and several spectacular sieges. The Canaanites were a higher material civilization than the Israelites, and must have had much better weapons, as well as strongly built stone cities. There is an air of desperation about the Israelites' conquest, and this helps to explain why they were so ruthless when they took a town. The first place to fall after the crossing of the Jordan was Jericho, one of the most ancient cities of the world. The excavations of Kathleen Canyon and carbon dating show that it goes back to the 7th millennium BC. It had enormous walls in the early and middle Bronze Ages, and the strength of its defenses produced one of the most vivid passages in the Bible. Joshua, the prophet general, ordered the priests to carry the ark round the city, and their ram's horn trumpeters on 6 consecutive days. And on the 7th, when the priest blew with the trumpets, he commanded to all the people, "Shout, for the Lord hath given you the city." Then the people shouted with a great shout, that the walls fell down flat, so that the people went up into the city. Owing to erosion, the Kenyan researchers threw no light on how the walls were destroyed. She thinks it may have been an earthquake, which the Israelites attributed to divine intervention. Well, that's brilliant. I need her to come up with an idea like that. I mean, come on. Wow. Here's to the academic sword. Yeah. The Bible narrative says, "And they utterly destroyed all that was in the city, both man and woman, young and old, and ox and sheep, and ass, with the edge of the sword." Miss Kenyon established that the city was certainly burnt at this time, and that in addition it was not reoccupied for a very long time afterwards, which accords with Joshua's determination that no one should rebuild it, and his threat, "Cursed be the man before the Lord that riseth up and buildeth this city Jericho." Joshua did not storm a city if he could avoid it. He preferred to negotiate a surrender, or better still, an alliance and peaceful settlement. This was what happened, for instance, at Gibeon. But its inhabitants, he discovered, had deceived him over the terms of their covenant, and though he saved them from the Israelite vengeance, he made them that day hewers of wood and drawers of water for the congregation. Gibeon says the Bible was a great city. Gibeon says the Bible was a great city, one of royal cities. Its precise location was finally established after the Second World War by an American archaeologist, James Pritchard. There are no fewer than 45 references to Gibeon in the Bible, and Pritchard was able to confirm many of them. It was the center of a fine wine-producing area, and the city had underground cellars for storing wine in 9-gallon vats. On the handles of no fewer than 25 of these, Pritchard found the letters G-B-N, Gibeon. The loss of the city was regarded as so important that 5 Amorite city kings tried to retake it. Joshua came to its rescue from Gilgal. and all the men of war with him, and all the mighty men of valor. He now had a small regular army, and defeated the Amorites in a hectic battle fought during the hailstorm. They were more which died from hailstones than they whom children of Israel slew with the sword. Then followed a dramatic scene. According to the Bible record, Joshua needed daylight to complete the destruction of the Amorite army. So he prayed to the Lord for the weather to clear. Sun, stand thou still upon Gibeon, and thou moon in the valley of Ajalon. And the sun stood still, and the moon stayed, until the people had avenged themselves upon their enemies. Joshua then went on to achieve a still more important victory over Jabin, king of Hazor, who had tried to create a coalition in the northern part of Canaan to keep out the Israelite intruders. He collected an enormous army, even as the sand that is upon the sea shore in multitude, but the Lord burnt their chariots with fire. Then Joshua turned back and took Hazor, and smote the king thereof with the sword. And they smote all the souls that were therein with the edge of the sword, utterly destroying them. There was not any left to breathe. And he burnt Hazor with fire. Hazor was thoroughly excavated by the Israeli archaeologist General Yagil Yadin in 1955 to 1959. He found a vast and splendid town with a lower section of 200 acres and a citadel of 24 acres, housing perhaps over 50,000 people. There were strong gates and massive walls. Here again the evidence of burning and destruction during the 13th century BC, the time of the Israelite conquest, is entirely consistent with the biblical record. Among the debris, Yadin found a deliberately mutilated temple stela of the moon god Baal Haman, with the uplifted hands symbolizing his wife Tanit. So evidently Joshua's men had carried out the injunction to tear down their altars. Despite Joshua's spectacular victories, however, the conquest of Canaan was by no means complete at the time of his death. The consolidation of the Israelite settlement, the reduction of the remaining towns, and the final occupation of the coast took more than 2 centuries, 1200 to 1000 BC, and was not accomplished until the unified kingdom of Israel came into being at the end of the millennium. The different Israelite tribes acted independently of each other and sometimes fought. They had a variety of enemies: Canaanite enclaves, incursive Bedouin tribes, and a new menace of the Philistines pushing in from the coast. They also, that would be modern-day Gaza, folks, and Philistines would be where the word Palestinian or Palestine was derived from, although it was I don't know, reinstilled or implanted by Hadrian in 135 AD. Anyway, that's personal footnote, whatever. But that's where that name Palestinian actually comes from, Philistines. And that's just a fact. And there's no P in the Arabic. Anyway, they also had to take over from the Canaanites they had beaten, restore the cities, work the land in the book of Joshua. God says to them, I have given you a land for which ye did not labor, and cities which ye built not, and ye dwell in them. Of the vineyards and olive yards which ye planted, do not eat. This is abundantly confirmed by excavations which show the Israelites strikingly inferior to their Canaanite predecessors in civil technology, notably building and pottery. The children of Israel had a lot to learn. Moreover, Palestine, though small, is a country of great variety, broken up into 40 different geographical and climatic units. That is what helps to give the land its extraordinary fascination and beauty. Yeah, and it's important to note that Canaan or Palestine, whatever you want to call it, was never this, unified territory, right? I mean, it was once the Jews got a hold of it, with the Allies or whatever. But these people were warring against each other, and who's to say that in the conquest, that many of the states were giving them and tribes were giving themselves over to Israel for a better future under the pressures or oppression of the more powerful Canaanite established kingdoms or tribes. Like, we just don't know. And it's quite possible that you never hear this, but it's quite possible that their particular possibilities of tyranny and wickedness are what led to the thin end of the wedge of the conquest of Israel over the land at the time. They don't. Anyway, it's just something to consider. I don't know. I'm just saying that it's funny how we don't always ask all the questions. We're usually inclined to go with what we want to believe in the first place and try to find the references that back that up. But, I mean, I can be accused of that too. Anyway, but it also tended to perpetuate tribal divisions and impede unity. The Israelite tradition, already strongly entrenched, of equality, communal discussion, acrimonious debate and argument, made them hostile to the idea of a centralized state with heavy taxes to pay for a standing army of professionals. They preferred tribal levies, serving without pay. The Book of Judges, covering the first 2 centuries of the settlement, gives the impression that the Israelites had more leadership than in fact they were prepared to tolerate. The judges were not national rulers holding power in succession. Normally they ran only one tribe each, and some may have been contemporaries. So every military coalition had to be negotiated on an ad hoc basis, summed up in the words of Barak, the chief of the Kadesh Naphtali, to Deborah, the warrior prophetess. If thou wilt go with me, then I will go. But if thou wilt not go with me, then I will not go. The Book of Judges. Though undoubted history and full of fascinating information about Canaan and the late Bronze Age, is flavored with mythical material and fantasy and presented in a confused fashion, so that it is difficult to work out a consecutive history of the period. This may not matter very much, for what the Book of Judges does convey is much more important. First, it illuminates the essentially democratic and meritocratic nature of Israelite society. It is a book of charismatic heroes, most of whom are lowborn, obtaining advancement, though their own energy and abilities, which are brought out by divine favor and nomination. Thus, when Eglon, the king of Moab, the oasis sheik who possessed the city of palm trees, oppressed part of the the Lord raised them up a deliverer in the shape of Ehud, a man left-handed, always a grave disadvantage in those times, especially for a poor man. Ehud was too lowly to have a weapon, so he made him a dagger, which had 2 edges, of a cubit length, hid it under his raiment, and got the local Israelites to contribute to the gift, by which he obtained admission to the sheik. Eblon was a very fat man, who was sitting in a summer parlor, which he had for himself alone. Ehud took out his homemade weapon, thrust it into the sheik's belly, and the fat closed upon the blade so that he could not draw the dagger out of his belly, and the dirt came out. This successful political assassination, carried out with great daring and skill, made Ehud a local commander, who then went on to subdue Moab, and the land had rest 80 years. Not only poor left-handed men, but even women rose to heroism, and so to command. Deborah, another figure from the Oasis country, was a fiery religious mystic who prophesied and sang. She dwelt under the palm tree, and local folk came up to her for judgment. This extraordinary woman, married to one of Lapidoth, though we hear nothing of him, organized a coalition army against Jabin, one of the senior kings of Canaan, and destroyed his army. As if this were not enough, the defeated Canaanite general, Sisera, took refuge in the tent of the still more ferocious Israelite woman Jael, wife of Heber, the Kenite, 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 and then in brackets he writes Canite, capital CAIN, hyphen ITE. Jael gave him a bed, allowed him to fall asleep, then pulled out a tent peg, took an hammer in her hand, and went softly unto him, and smote the nail into his temples, and fastened it to the ground. Whereupon Deborah, in the special sing-song tone, which was the mark of the prophet, burst into a victory hymn, a savage and beautiful poem which descants on the appalling and treacherous act of violence. Then there was Jephthah, lowliest of all, the son of a prostitute, who was thrust out of his father's house while still young by his elder brothers because of his mother's trade. Jephthah had no choice but to dwell in the Badlands and form a band, and there were gathered vain men to Jephthah, and went out with him. When the Ammonites attacked, this bandit leader, in a reversal of a natural order which was becoming typical of Israelite history, was sought out by the prominent members of the local Israelite establishment, who asked him to become their war captain. He agreed, on condition he remained their leader in peace too. After a surprising attempt to negotiate a peaceful agreement, the stories in Judges are never without unusual twists, and this passage contains a fascinating glimpse into contemporary diplomatic religious procedure. Jephthah swore a great oath to the Lord to solicit his help. Having received it, he defeated the enemy in battle and took 20 cities, with a very great slaughter. Thus the children of Ammon were subdued.
But the terms of his oath were to sacrifice to the Lord whoever met him from his house when he returned home. And in the event this was his only child and daughter who came out to meet him with timbrels and dances. So, in this strange and horrible story, Jephthah feels obliged to fulfill his vow and sacrifice his child, and the daughter meekly accepts her fate, stipulating only a respite of 2 months, so that she and her maidens may go up and down upon the mountain, and bewail my virginity, I and my fellows. We do not even know the name of this incident and tragic creature.
Strangest of all are the 3 chapters of the book of Judges which describe the rise and fall and the martyr's death of Samson. He was another low-born member of society, a Nazarite with wild, long hair, dedicated in some way now obscure to us, to divine service. There is no question that Samson, despite the mythical elements in the narrative, which turn him into an Israelite Hercules, is a real person. A curious mixture of juvenile delinquent and hero, a strong man and a half-wit, with a paranoid streak of violence, a love of vandalism and arson, and a taste for low debauchery and wicked women. He is the outstanding example of the point which the book of Judges makes again and again, that the Lord and society are often served by semi-criminal types, outlaws, and misfits, who become, by their exploits, folk heroes, and then in time religious heroes. Israel was by its religious nature a puritanical society, but it is remarkable how often the Lord turns to sinners or responds generously when they turn to him. Thus Samson, disgraced, blinded, and with fetters of brass, shouts to the Lord, O Lord God, remember me, I pray thee, and strengthen me. I pray thee, only this once, O God, that I may be avenged of the Philistines for my 2 eyes. God apparently responded, though the Bible does not actually say so. Some of Samson's exploits are the least plausible recorded in Judges, but the background to his story is authentic. The pressure of the Philistines from the coast was then just beginning to be felt, and there was no warfare between them, and the Israelites and Samson does not lead an army. On the contrary, there is constant contact and trade, even intermarriage, and this is attested by the archaeological evidence, such as the Philistine artifacts found in the Israelite town of Beth Shemesh. The marbles of Judges are always built upon the substratum of truth. This raises the second point about the period. The Israelites were enlarging the imaginative gifts we have already noticed, and seen from this point of view, Judges is one of the greatest collections of short stories in the whole of world literature. There is an underlying unity of theme, but an astonishing variety of incident. The economy of means is admirable. Vivid characters are sketched in a sentence or two and leap from the page, and ingeniously selected detail brings the background to life. The narrative is swift and deft. There is also a feature of the Bible which we notice here for the first time, the superfluous but unforgettable detail. Thus, in chapter 12, we are told that the escaping Ephraimites who were taken at the Jordan passage
were forced to say the word Shibboleth, because the Gileadites knew they could not pronounce the sibilant sh. Hence, when they said Sibboleth, they were identified and slaughtered. The detail is not in any way important to the story, but it struck the narrator so forcibly, as it strikes us, that he could not bear to leave it out. We find this instinct again in the story of the young David in the first book of Samuel, appearing before Achish, king of Gath, feigning madness, so that he scrabbled on the doors of the gate and let his spittle fall down upon his beard, provoking Achish to the furious comment, "Have I need of madmen, that ye have brought this fellow to play the madman in my presence?" Or again, the brilliant writer responsible for the second book of Samuel feels he has to give us some fascinating details about Solomon's officer, Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, who had done many acts. He slew 2 lion-like men of Moab. He went down also and slew a lion in the midst of a pit in time of snow. And he slew an Egyptian, a goodly man, and an Egyptian had a spear in his hand. But he went down to him with a staff, and plucked the spear out of the Egyptian's hand, and slew him with his own spear. This instinct was not merely or chiefly literary. It was historical. Israelite love of the past was so strong that they crammed their narratives with picturesque information, even when the didactic purpose was unclear or non-existent. The tales in the books of Judges and Samuel are not just short stories. They are history. Indeed, in the books of Samuel, they are beginning to be great history. There is an Israelite Jewish literature of this period, none of the aimlessness of pagan myth and chronicle. The narrative is set down with an overwhelming purpose to tell the story, both elevating and minatory, of a people's relationship with God. And because the purpose is so serious, the story must be accurate. That is, the writer must believe in it, in his heart. So it is history, and since it deals with the evolution of institutions as well as war and conquest, it is peculiarly instructive history to us. Indeed, the book of Judges, naive though it is, in some ways, is in another an essay on constitutional development, for it shows how the Israelites were obliged by harsh facts to modify their democratic theocracy to the extent of establishing limited kingship. Early in the book, chapters 6 and 8, it tells the story of Gideon, another poor and lowly man who threshed wheat by the winepress and was raised up by God to be a mighty man of valor. Gideon was originally a commander on a small scale with a mere 300 men, but his eventual success was so great that he was, for the first time in Israel's history, offered the hereditary kingship. Then the men of Israel said unto Gideon, Rule thou over us, both thou and thy son son also, for thou hast delivered us from the hand of Midian. Gideon replied, I will not rule over you, neither shall my son rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you. This good and humble man, in rejecting the crown, was stressing that Israel was still a theocracy. Even so, some historians believe that the house of Gideon would nonetheless have become the royal line of Israel, had not Gideon's son, Abimelech, developed into a monster and committed one of the most stupefying crimes in the entire Bible, slaughtering 70 of his father's male children. That ruled out the tragic house of Gideon, but much of the rest of the book of Judges shows by implication the unsatisfactory nature of the disunited tribal system, with the repeated moral. In those days there was no king in Israel, and every man did what was right in his own eyes. The story of Jephthah ends in a brief and violent episode of Israelite civil war. The last 3 chapters of the book narrate the atrocities, rape, killing of the Levite's concubine in the Benjamite town of Gibeah, which leads to a desperately cruel dispute between the Benjamites and the other tribes, a sort of miniature Trojan War. And in the meantime, the Philistine menace was increasing as the tribes of Israel fought amongst themselves. The way the facts are presented may be ex post facto royalist propaganda, as some scholars argue. But the facts themselves were plain enough. An external enemy brought the tribes together, and Israel adopted a central system of command for war because it had no alternative. The Philistines were a far more formidable opponent than the indigenous Canaanites, whom the Israelites were in the process of dispossessing or turning into helots. Indeed, there are recurrent hints in the Bible that the Israelites had feelings of guilt about waking the Canaanites' land. A curious adumbration of Israeli twinges about homeless Palestinian Arabs in the late 20th century. The Israelites, however, hid any remorse in the belief that the conquest was a pious act. It is because of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord is driving them out before you. The Philistines, by contrast, were themselves aggressors. No room for doubts there. They formed part of the most predatory race of the late Bronze Age, the so-called peoples of the sea, who wrecked what was left of Minoan civilization in Crete and came close to taking over Egypt. When the great 19th dynasty pharaoh, Ramses III, drove them out of the Nile area in the battles magnificently portrayed in Karnak. These Pelesti, P-U-L-E-S-T-I, turned northeast and established themselves on the coast which still carries their name, Palestine. The 5 great cities they built there, Ascalon, Ashdod, Ekron, Gath, and Gaza, have not been systematically excavated, and there is still a lot to be learned about their culture. But they were unquestionably warlike. They already had iron weapons. They were organized with great discipline under a feudal military aristocracy. Around 1050 BC, having exterminated the coastal Canaanites, they began a large-scale movement against the interior hill lands, now mainly occupied by Israelites. They seem to have conquered most of Judah in the south, but nothing east of Jordan or in the northern Galilee. The tribe of Benjamin suffered most from them and spearheaded the resistance. Now that's an interesting paragraph. First of all, introducing the reminder that even Philistia, the name of that Gazan nation that Johnson doesn't use here, Philistia was not indigenous. Even ancient Philistia was not indigenous. It was more of a derivative of the peoples of the sea, meaning, some have suggested Carthaginian. They were driven east, off of Crete, right? They were coming east from being driven off, landed in Gaza, established themselves there. Think people want to hear that today? I'm just saying, like, you know, the whole area was so unstable, and but that is an interesting point. Um, I My only reference to them being militaristic or aggressive or whatever, of course, has to do with Israel being in battle with them during the time of David and during the time of Samson, during the time of some, Gaza was always a problem, or Philistia, better known as, which would later become. Anyway, yeah, but no, what I found interesting was this name that was granted the people that came to Gaza, Palestai. Pulesti is the transliteration he gives here. The Palestai. That is interesting. Now, this might be old news to some people who have done their homework, but this is the first I've come across it. I'm liking it. That's pretty interesting. Portrayed at Karnak. Anyway, moving right along. The period beginning with the national campaign against the Philistines is exceptionally rich in documentation. By this time, the Israelites had developed a passion for writing history. Most of this material has disappeared forever. The Book of Judges gives tantalizing references to lost chronicles. We also hear of the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel, the books of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah, the book of the Acts of Solomon, and many other works. But those that survive, especially the 2 books of Samuel and the 2 books of Kings, are history on the grand scale, among the greatest works of all antiquity. They incorporate in places material from the royal archives, such as lists of government officials, provincial governors, and even the menus of the royal kitchens. From these times, it is possible to establish synchronisms between the king lists given in the Bible and the non-biblical sources such as the Egyptian pharaoh canons and the Assyrian Limu or eponym list. These enable us to make accurate datings. In the early monarchical period, the margin of error may be 10 years or so, but later we get virtually absolute dates. Thus, we can be fairly sure that Saul was killed about 1005 BC and David reigned until 966, and that Solomon died in either 926 or 925 BC. Moreover, the biblical records give us astonishingly vivid portraits of the principal actors in the national drama, portraits which rival and even surpass those we find in the finest Greek historians more than half a millennium later. These characters are placed firmly in a consistent ethical setting, but there is not merely good and evil in these historical moralities. There is every shade of conduct, and above all, pathos, intense sadness, human love, in all its complexity, emotions never before set down in words by man. There is, too, a veneration for abstract institutions, a sense of national choices and constitutional issues. What emerges from the record is that though the Israelites turned to kingship in response to the threat of annihilation by Philistine power, they did so with great reluctance, and through the medium of an earlier institution, the prophetship. Abraham had been a prophet. Moses was the greatest of the prophets. It was the oldest office the Israelites had, and in their eyes an essential one, since in a theocracy like theirs, the medium through whom God issues his commands, the prophet held a central place in society. The origins of the word Napi are obscure. It may have meant one who is called, or one who bubbles forth. An important text in Samuel says, "He that is now called a Nabi was previously called a Roa seer." Prophets were certainly judged by their ability to predict. Such men were found everywhere in the ancient Near East. One of the great strands of ancient Egyptian history from the early 3rd millennium onward is the role of oracles and prophecies. From Egypt it spread to the Phoenicians, and thus to the Greeks. According to Plato's Phaedrus, human reasoning was not necessary for prophecy, since a man possessed by a god was a mere agent. His state was known as enthusiasm or divine madness. The Israelite prophets likewise acted as mediums. In a state of trance or frenzy, they related their divine visions in a single song chant, at times a scream. These states could be induced by music. Samuel describes the process himself. "Thou shalt meet a company of prophets coming down from the high place with a psaltery, and a tabret, and a pipe, and a harp before them, and they shall prophesy." Elisha, too, asked for music, but "now bring me a minstrel." And it came to pass, when the minstrel played, that the hand of the Lord came upon him. But the prophets also used, and sometimes abused, incense, narcotics, and alcohol, as Isaiah points out. Okay. There's a reference and a source that, I don't know, I guess that could be attached to the one that I was asking about earlier, right? That would be it. Thank you very much. "The priest and the prophet have erred through strong drink. They have swallowed up of wine. They are out of the way through strong drink. They err in vision. They stumble in judgment." Okay, right? So, therefore, okay. The prophet is basically exposing the false prophets, obviously. Jeremiah did this too. A lot of the prominent prophets during their times turned out to be false prophets. Not just by the people sitting around and seeing that what they were saying was horse poop, but that the prophets themselves, who remain clean of these things, would go as far as to expose them. It should be noted that the main thing a prophet would, detect a false prophet over would be the separation of that prophet from the laws. We seldom talk about that, but I was reading Jeremiah recently, and I noticed how there's clear references that he chastises them from turning away from God's law. Whereas sometimes there's confusion made where Isaiah talks about the lack of social justice for the widow or the fatherless child, and so on and so forth, just as important. Whereas he mentions those things despite the vain offerings of sacrifice, people going through the motions. Whereas Jeremiah, more precisely, comes to the point of breaking away from the law, hence them being punished. Anyway, They err in vision, they stumble in judgment. Okay, so these drunks and drug addicts, yeah, groovy, man. They, yeah, yeah. So in a way, I was like happy. I'm seeing that, oh, I see the reference he was making there. Yeah, but these aren't the prophets that were taken seriously, obviously, not by the pious. So there you go. Like again, right? Distinctions are made. Next paragraph. In Israelite society, however, the prophet was much more than a man who went into ecstasy and tried to predict the future. They performed all kinds of spiritual functions. They were religious judges, like Moses and Deborah. They formed colleges attached to shrines, like the one at Shiloh, where the tiny Samuel was deposited by his mother Hannah. There he ministered before the Lord, being a child, girded with a linen ephod. Just like a priest, in fact. His mother brought him a new little priestly coat every year, when she came up with her husband to offer the yearly sacrifice. So at many shrines, priests and guilds of prophets worked side by side, and there was no necessary conflict between them. But almost from the beginning, the prophets set more store on the content as opposed to the forms of religion, thus inaugurating one of the great themes of Jewish and indeed world history. As Samuel put it himself, behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to hearken than the fat of rams. They stood for the puritanical and fundamentalist elements in the religion, as opposed to the empty ceremonies and endless sacrifices of the priest. But just as the priest tended to slip into mechanistic religion, that would be mechanistic, mechanical, right? So the prophets might drift into sectarianism. It's important to note, too, that the priest could be accused of these mechanistic I don't know, not vanities, but whatever activities. But it's important to remember that the priests are there on account of the people themselves, right? The sacrifices are given over to the priest, which make the sacrifices for the people. You know what I mean? So it's important to realize that, like, a prophet like Isaiah, he's throwing his head out at the people, too, who are just, they're bringing their sacrifices to get themselves out of there. Oh, I'm covered, right? I'll just give a sacrifice and I'm covered for it. It's not just... Anyway. Moving on. Let's see. Indeed, Samuel, like Samson, belonged to the sect of the Nazarites, wild-looking men with uncut hair and few clothes. These sects might diverge into heresy or even into an entirely new religion. The Nazarites had much in common with the ultra-strict and ferocious Rechabites, who engaged in massacres of backsliders when opportunity offered. Such sects were the most extreme monotheist and iconoclast. They tended to drift into semi-nomad life on the fringe of the desert, a featureless place conducive to strict monotheism. It was from such a background that the greatest of all Jewish sectarian heresies was to spring: Islam. There were then multitudes of prophets, many of them false ones, as the Bible frequently stresses. To be influential, a prophet had to avoid the extremes of sectarianism and remain in touch with the mainstream of Israelite life. His greatest single function was to act as intermediary between God and people, and to do that he must mingle with the masses. When Samuel matured, he acted as a judge, traveling all over the country. When the powerful Philistine forces struck at the heart of the Israelite settlements, inflicting humiliating defeats, even capturing the ark itself, and it seems destroying the Shiloh shrine, it was natural that the people should turn to Samuel, and that he should play the critical role in deciding whether, and if so, how, the Israelites, in their desperation, should embrace kingship. The first book of Samuel gives us exciting glimpses into the anxious constitutional debates which took place on the issue. There was an obvious candidate, the Benjamite guerrilla captain Saul, typical of the charismatic Israelite leaders who sprang from nothing by their own energy and divine favor. But Saul was a southerner and lacked the diplomatic skills to conciliate the northerners, whose wholehearted support he never obtained. His dark, saturnine character is brilliantly portrayed in the Bible. An unpredictable Oriental potentate bandit, alternating between sudden generosity and unbridled rage, a manic depressive perhaps, always brave and clearly gifted, but often hovering on the brink of madness and sometimes slipping over it. Samuel was right to hesitate before anointing this man. He also reminded the people that they had never had a king. One function of the prophets was to deliver popular history lectures, and that, being a theocracy for Israel, to choose rule by king was to reject rule by God, and thus sinful. He outlined the nation's constitutional history and wrote it in a book and laid it up before the Lord, that is, deposited it at a shrine. He was willing to anoint Saul as a charismatic leader, or Nagid, by pouring oil on his head, but hesitated to make him Melech, or hereditary king, which implied the right to summon the tribal levy. He warned the people of all the disadvantages of monarchy, professional armies, punitive taxation, forced labor. He seems to have changed his mind several times about the precise powers Saul should have. But in the end, Saul's early victories and his striking appearance, he was exceptionally tall and handsome, made the popular will irresistible, and Samuel reluctantly complied, pleading divine guidance. And the Lord said to Samuel, "Hearken unto their voice, and make him a king." This early constitutional experiment in kingship ended in disaster. A year after Saul's coronation, the great Philistine army came up through the plain of Esdraelon and destroyed the new royal army at Mount Gilboa, Saul and his son Jonathan being killed. Saul obviously lacked the temperament to unite the country behind him, but the real reason for his failure was absence of the requisite military background. He was no more than a small-scale resistance leader, and though, as king, he began to recruit a mercenary army, it was clearly beyond his skill to handle large regular forces. But even before the final disaster, Saul had lost the support of the clergy and the confidence of Samuel. In chapter 15 of the first book of Samuel, there is a vivid and heartbreaking scene in which the old prophet turns on the king for acts of religious disobedience over the spoils of war. The king, abashed, admits his sin, but begs Samuel to give him his public countenance in front of the people. Samuel does so, but in his anger and frustration he turns on a wretched royal prisoner, Agag, king of the Amalekites, who came unto him delicately, pleading, "Surely the bitterness of death is past." But Samuel hewed Agag in pieces on the altar. There had always been a fanatical streak in Samuel, especially against the Amalekites, whose extermination he demanded. He refused to see King Saul again. Okay, excuse me, back up, right? See, like Samuel, oh, yeah, the nut fanatic, right? He demanded extermination of the Amalekites. No. Samuel was a prophet, right? Samuel was a prophet, and the idea, I'm not talking about what people believe, but the idea was that God told Samuel to tell the people that the Amalekites must die, be wiped out, obliterated, all of that. And if people thought the potential sacrifice of Abraham's son was a test, imagine that, right? Imagine going up. I heard the description once, people like to, religious people like to believe that they're devoted and all that, and they work towards things, they want to try whatever. But imagine, okay, sorry, Amalek baby, sorry, you're dead, die. Sorry, your animals die, you're wiped out, like God's wrath kind of thing. I think a lot of people can't get their head around that, but that was ultimately the thing that led to Saul's downfall. But let's continue reading. But let's not forget that, where Samuel was taking his orders from. Again, I'm not talking about what you believe or what people believe or don't believe or all that, but, the Bible was pretty clear about that. Try to make out like Samuel did this on his own accord. It was his own, stop it. Anyway, Saul, getting back to Saul. He refused to see King Saul again. Nevertheless, the record adds, when Saul was killed, Samuel mourned for him, and the Lord repented that he had made Saul king over Israel. And I guess we'll wrap it up there. I'm imagining the next thing we'll be getting into from Johnson's history is into David and Solomon and so forth. Yeah. Okay, so we'll hang in there and we'll see you next time.